Hello again, my name is Justin Stairs. This is the Brussels Signal Studio, and we're very happy to have Mr. Yalchin Rafiyev. Thank you for coming into the studio. Mr. Rafiyev is Deputy Foreign Minister of the Republic of Azerbaijan and lead negotiator for the COP29 negotiations, which are due to take place in Baku in November. It's a fortnight of talks, if I understand correctly. And I would like to start out with some basic questions, please, sir. Firstly, COP29, obviously that stands for Conference of the Parties. I mean, we're talking here about global negotiations designed to save the planet from climate change. Is that fair?
Yes, we could call it as well. First of all, thank you very much for the invitation. Yes, this is a conference of parties to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. So the parties come together and really negotiate to find solutions, collective solutions to the global climate problems.
Okay, and the goal is to limit the increase in global temperatures to, now, is it 1.5% above pre-industrial levels or is it 2%?
The Paris Agreement puts a target of 2%, but preferably 1.5.
Right. And is it too late already for 1.5? I've seen some articles referring to the fact that we might have hit that level already.
Scientific evidences so far show that we haven't overshoot yet 1.5 degree, but all the efforts globally, including the COP process itself, is targeting to have 1.5 not to be overshoot, like to still remain 1.5 aligned.
So it's still possible?
It's still possible, and it depends on how we collectively act.
Okay, and so please describe exactly what your job entails. I know here we are in Brussels, you've been meeting people, I presume, in the European institutions.
Yes.
I mean, are you supposed to get as much of the work done as possible before the Baku summit? Is that essentially what your job is?
Yes, you may also call it so, that my main job is as a lead negotiator. The negotiations will be happening during the COP in November. And part of it already happened in Bonn during the Bonn session, but still UAE presidency continuing, and UAE lead negotiator was the one who were leading the process. But in November, during the COP29, I will be, as a lead negotiator, bringing together parties to agree on the negotiated text together with the subsidiary body chairs. But in this period, up until COP29, I'm traveling to several parties, reaching out to parties and negotiating groups to see what are their major interests and concerns, and where are the converging points and where are the discrepancies among them on the major expected deliverables from COP29.
Right, okay. Well, I'd like to ask a bit more on that, but just to set the scene, if you like, at COP28, it was agreed that the world should transition away from fossil fuels, correct?
Yes.
And this was the first time that this had actually been agreed. I mean, there have been a lot of talks to arrive at this point. Some people felt that this was not enough, that the agreement should have been to phase out fossil fuels entirely. Why, in your opinion, was this ambitious target not met? Is it fair to say that the fossil fuel lobby is still very strong?
I think it's not about the lobbyists working on this matter, but if you look at the matter from realistic point of view, calling the fossil fuel countries to phase out is in the near term not possible, not realistic, because this is a long-standing industry that has been built, and for many countries it's a main source of revenue. And transitioning away is, I think, that was adopted at the end of the COP28, was the reflection of much realistic approach to this, that we are transitioning away and at some point we may phase out. So I cannot give, of course, preference to any part of the parties or their positions, but since the parties agreed on this term, it means that the consensual consideration of the matter was like this. I mean, the still
Okay.
parties are still not ready to.
It's a consensus process.
Yes.
Now, as I understand it, one of the big issues in November will be finance. It's all very well to come to an agreement on some kind of target, but then the next question is who is going to pay for it? Trillions of dollars, euros, however you want to put it, will be required, and it will require large transfers from the so-called developed world to the so-called developing world. Now, um, as I understand it, I ask you to explain what the obstacles are. But according to what the research I've done, one of the problems is risk. For example, people are hesitant, the World Bank even hesitant to invest in places like Africa because of the risks involved. Is that the main sticking point here?
I mean, you are talking about two a bit separate things. One, this money, the finance flow from global north, so-called, to global south, from developed countries to developing countries. This is a development assistance. It's a kind of grant-based or loan-based concession of funding that we are talking about. It's coming from the Paris Agreement. The developed countries should help the efforts of the developing countries. And in Copenhagen in 2009, the parties agreed on 100 billion amount annually to be flown from north to south. But now we are discussing in Baku what should be the new figure, take into account of 100 billion as a floor amount, how much should it increase, and who should pay for that. So we have the Paris Agreement where some of those questions are being answered in terms of the contributors, who should be the contributors and others. But still, the parties continue negotiations because the amount that is expected to be adopted is very high, that some group of countries couldn't be sufficient. The amount, their contributions couldn't be sufficient. And it also brings another element to the topic, which is how private sector can be involved or how additional non-party stakeholders can be involved into the process. And that brings me to your second question on the investment part. Yes, indeed, in Africa, for example, you rightly mentioned, there is more than 50% of the global solar power capacity, but only 1% of the global investment in solar power. And one of the reasons for that is the risk perception in this area, that those investors, potential investors, business community, are reluctant to put their money to invest because of their perception of risk, that if they put this money, they can lose it. But empirical research say that it's not applicable to all cases. Actually, most of the investments put in these countries actually bring revenue. So we need to work out a model or solution that could also encourage the private sector to invest more in developing countries, and or to have a de-risking mechanisms that can encourage the business community to go and invest in these countries. In this case, we will have this also. It will definitely affect also the NDC, new NDC cycle, national determined contributions.
De-risking, what does that mean? Could you give me an example?
Yeah, the risking means that if the private sector goes and invests somewhere in any of the developing countries, this mechanism gives you assurance that in case you lose your
Some
money,
kind of guarantee.
yeah, kind of a guarantee that I will guarantee your investment.
Right. Okay. Okay. And will that work? Would that be enough to actually kickstart private sector investment?
At least it could move the process from where it was for several years that no progress has been made. And if we start the movement and if we see results coming from this, then we can maybe encourage further engagement of the private sector in developing countries.
Okay. And just on the subject of the World Bank, and I've read criticism of institutions such as the World Bank. Is that criticism fair? They haven't been prepared to invest enough?
I think it's not only for World Bank, but all multilateral development banks, international financial institutions are being criticized not doing enough in terms of climate action. And the problem is not about the existence of the resources or not, but the problem is about how accessible are these resources and funds. The main complaints are about accessibility issue. Like these funds, banks, financial institutions, they have very complicated procedure of granting the funds to the developing countries. Usually takes some years to get it. And for small island developing states, for example, whenever they face a natural disaster and they apply for World Bank or other MDBs, for example, to give them some funding to recover, it takes some years, and then it doesn't
Too
make any
slow.
sense. Yeah, too slow, and doesn't make any sense for them after that. So now, what is needed in this international financial system to be reformed to be much accessible for the countries, not to have more money, but to make the money more accessible.
Okay, get the money quicker.
Yes, exactly.
Okay. Now, what about the possibility of filling the funding gap via some kind of world tax? I mean, there have been people calling for some kind of levy on aviation, for example, windfall taxes on fossil fuel providers. Is that feasible?
This is also a long-standing issue to be discussed within the community, but so far no major progress have been made. It's being discussed within the maritime domain and also in the aviation part. Some parties are raising this issue, but there is a very stubborn resistance by some parties to calling it levy or tax, because it's somehow affects also the national legislations of these countries that need to be reformed in a way.
Okay, so are you saying it's feasible or not?
It could be feasible in terms of providing additional source of funding, but if there are some better ways to get it, then I think we can put it at least on hold.
Okay, and then there's another debate, as I understand it, between definitions of developed countries and developing countries, which are long-standing definitions, right? But maybe need updating because some of the developing countries are now relatively wealthy.
Yes, but Paris Agreement is very clear about who are the developing countries and who are the developed countries, and also there was a explicit reference to the developing countries in a capacity to do so. I mean, to fund something. But Paris Agreement is also very much clear about who should be paying and how the finance flow should be organized.
Okay, so that's not going to change, it sounds like.
For it to be changed, we need to change also Paris Agreement.
Okay, okay, understood. Now, here in Brussels, you've been meeting people today. It has been something of a backlash against green policy in general. We've seen it in the EU elections that took place in June. We've seen it right here on the square in front of the European Parliament, where the farmers brought everything to a standstill. There are concerns that the move to greener, sustainable policies will do economic damage, and certain sectors of society will be harmed by this move. Is this a feeling that you've had in Europe and outside Europe during the discussions you've had so far?
No, I haven't heard about this because for most countries, the countries are different. Their level of development are different. Their preferences, their sectorial approach, and also the level of danger coming from the climate change to them are different. So therefore, their perceptions are quite different. And in the climate negotiations, usually the parties are discussing what is common for them. They are not talking about peculiarities for some regions or countries, but mostly the global issues that affect them all.
Okay, so there is no break on your job essentially from this so-called environmental backlash.
No.
Okay, okay. Well, that's a very clear answer. Now, what about the economic aspects of any deal that might appear? I mean, there have been allegations. It's a politically sensitive subject, but dumping allegations, for example, against countries such as China with regard to solar power and electric vehicles. I mean, there is clearly a need for some kind of level playing field. Does this come within the remit of your discussions?
You mean those countries to be also part of the
Well,
global donor
right. I mean,
community?
there is a need for some kind of level playing field. Some people, I mean, the US and the European Union are considering anti-dumping quotas and tariffs, rather, against China, for example. Is this an issue that's going to have to be discussed in Baku?
No. Usually the countries are refraining also, since all are interested in getting consensual outcomes of the process. The countries are trying to avoid any finger pointing or any kind of subjecting any particular party to criticism or to any particular unilateral measures, but rather to focus on those issues that bring them together. And we are, and I'm in my lead negotiator capacity, trying to bridge the gaps and bring the parties together and focus on those issues that can bring the parties together rather than divide them.
Okay. Could the US elections affect the process, do you think?
I wouldn't single out any particular elections, because this year is election year, and in 60 countries, more than 4 billion people are going to elections. Of course, political dynamics within any country affect the decision-making process, but we hope that U.S. elections or any elections in any other part of the world. Recently, we had UK elections as well. The Labours won there. We had elections in the European Union, and we are expecting some more elections happening in other parts of the world. We hope that the global understanding and urgency of the matter will prevail in the negotiations rather than having any political dynamics being changed within the countries.
But you know why I refer to the US. Under the first Trump presidency, for example, there was a clear shift in US policy as far as climate change was concerned, and we witnessed this in the institutions globally. Is this not a risk if President Trump comes back?
I cannot, of course, prejudge the outcome of any elections by saying any particular scenarios. But we, when we formulate our strategy of negotiations, we take into account all the scenarios that could be developed, and we also are consulting closely with those countries concerned where the elections will be happening, to see what could be the developments and how we can fix it in order to get the successful outcome.
What do you mean by fix it?
To find alternative ways of dealing with the issues, like how if we, for example, in the case of elections in the US, US is a donor of the one of the donor countries out of 100 billion. So we at least try to we in our conversation with the US colleagues, we try to maintain the portion of US contribution into the new collective quantified goal rather than backsliding.
Right, so you urge them to keep to their promises? Is that a
Yes, because this
way
is
of-
something coming from the agreement, and it's a legal liability issue, besides being a kind of a moral matter that developed countries should help developing countries, but this is a legal liability issue.
Okay, so you're hopeful that countries such as the US will stick to their promise irrespective of who is in power?
Yes, and we are trying to also maintain this spirit within the negotiating process.
Okay. Now, Azerbaijan is a country that's heavily dependent on fossil fuel. Oil and gas are responsible for 90% of exports. Is that figure correct?
I think it's less than this.
Okay, and a large percentage, I have here 60% of the state budget. Is your country capable of moving to a sustainable energy mix?
Sure, we are investing a lot on renewables, on wind energy, on solar energy. Our biggest oil company, energy company, SOCAR, announced 2050 net zero pledge. We have joined recently a methane pledge, which also give us some commitments to reduce methane emission, and it will of course necessitate to have some transitioning in the energy system. But yes, we are putting a lot of efforts to transition our energy system.
Is it true that Azerbaijan currently subsidizes energy consumption? It's a society-wide policy, is that correct? It's just that I've been reading there have been calls for the country to move from general subsidies on energy to more specific subsidies for those who are energy poor or in need?
I cannot answer this question because I'm not aware what you are asking.
Okay, fair enough. And a final couple of questions. In the run up to Baku, obviously, the world's attention will be on your capital city. There have been allegations that there has been a crackdown on dissent in the run up to November, arrests of journalists and media executives. Is this true?
No, I deny this accusations that there is no crackdown in human rights in Azerbaijan, no the political prisoners or something like this. This kind of issues usually being raised.
Okay, I mean, it's just some of the NGOs, obviously, they produce lists of people who have been arrested, for example, media executives. Are you saying these lists are
Of
fake?
course, of course, I cannot comment on any ongoing judicial processes, but what I can tell you is that there is no any political prisoner or anybody arrested on a political terms in Azerbaijan.
Okay, and as I understand it, there are negotiations going on right of assembly, for example. Will everyone be free to express themselves during the summit period, the fortnight?
Of course, those rights that have been granted to the participants of the COP event by the United Nations, of course, will be provided to all the participants, all the groups that are coming. And as in all other cases, like before even the COP process, all the rights and freedoms will be granted by Azerbaijani government as a host country.
Very good. Mr. Rafiev, thank you once again for your time. Thank you for coming to the Brussels Signal studio.
Thank you so much for the invitation once again.